Welcome to the Digital Futures talk on digital technologies in the post-pandemic future. I'm very happy to have this conversation with Areti, Markopoulou, Shiel, Mette, Thomsen, and Yuan. And I guess usually it would be my role as a host to basically introduce you, but because this may be a slightly strange situation if I talk about someone who's not being seen on the screen, I thought in this particular session you may introduce yourself with a couple of sentences. So Areti, would you start?
Sure. Hello, everybody. Thank you for the invite, Achim and the Digital Futures. I am Areti Markopoulou. I'm the academic director at IAAC, the Institute for Advanced Architecture of Catalonia in Barcelona. And I am an architect, an educator, and an urban technologist, and looking forward to the discussion of today.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Bob Shiel, Director of the Bartlett School of Architecture at University College London, where I've been for most of my life, I think. I was a student there. I've been director for the past 6 years. One of the things perhaps that pertains to this conversation is I kind of have grown out of the workshop and I've seen digital fabrication emerge in our school over the last 25, 30 years or so. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion and to catch up with my friends here. So looking forward to this a lot. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mette Thomsen. I'm a professor here at the Academy in Copenhagen, where I lead the Center for IT and Architecture, CITA. Thank you again also for the invite. It's really nice to take part of this discussion, and I think it'll be really interesting to see the different perspectives on how we cope with this situation and what it means for our futures.
Hello, this is Yuan from Shanghai. I'm a professor in Tongji University. I'm also the director of Digital Design Research Center here. At the same time, I'm great thanks to Achim to hold these special talks with Bob Shiel, Areti, and Mette, and all good friends. So it's a great honor to host the Futures in the past 9 years. So this year is really special because the post-pandemic era. I think the new knowledge system is right now set up how to learning from each other, how to sharing the knowledge with each other. So it's a great opportunity today to have a special talks with all you guys, and I'm looking forward to have a very meaningful talk and to sharing our attitude and our vision in the new culture in the architecture world. So thank you.
Okay, thanks. So maybe lastly, myself, I'm Achim Menges, the director of the Institute for Computational Design and Construction at the University of Stuttgart, and an architect. And I have to thank you, Philip, for actually setting this up. I think it's a very special moment for the Digital Futures series, which has been going on for more than 10 years, I think. And we had the pleasure to be part of this several times. But I think this time, as you said, given the special situation, it has turned into a very, very special format. So thank you for actually making this possible and for initiating this great series of talks. So maybe we kick off the conversation immediately, and I may start with a question that relates to the, I would say, fairly unprecedented situation that we are currently experiencing due to the global COVID-19 virus. And I think it's fair to say that in history, moments of crisis have often been moments of innovation. So my first question would relate to, what do you think will actually really change in this post-pandemic future that we're all looking forward to? And maybe also what will remain unchanged? And to not make it sort of an overly general question, I would really be interested in knowing what impact these changes that you envision have on your particular field of research in the field of digital technologies. Mette, I'm sure you have something to say about this.
Yes, I will volunteer. Well, I think there's a very immediate thing happening around us, which is that as our universities close down, then the access to the physical contact, the physical teaching that we are engaged in, and which is part of a sort of broader architectural culture of direct contact and direct teaching one-to-one, that is fundamentally changed. So the sort of idea of sitting around a piece of work, a drawing or a model or prototype changes fundamentally. And I think, I mean, in the sort of craziness of the situation, it has been a moment of just trying to find other means of it. And it has been difficult to strategize sort of overarchingly how to transform these methods of dissemination. But I think it's been an interesting period in which we have seen new formats that are mixing often online media, that are, trying to figure out how it is that we teach something which is so materially driven across a screen like this. And I have seen our students in our environment all have to re-articulate and tackle their projects through simulation, through other kinds of tools than they would normally be engaged with. And this has not necessarily, I mean, it's also been a very creative period for them to engage with other kinds of methods or broader palette of methods, let's say, than they would normally do. So I don't know how I mean, I think there's something about that our curriculum can be transformed through this ability to work across different platforms, but at the same time, so online and offline platforms. But at the same time, I think we're all very much looking forward to returning back into the studio and being able to work directly with technologies as machining and physical materials. So I'm not sure it's completely, it's not like there's a new pathway before us that's clearly seen. It's just that I can see that the sort of portfolio of media is expanding.
I can kind of follow up on that and agree with everything Mette has said, but not to take the easy approach. There are other things to add maybe and augment this. Some things have both changed and unchanged in a funny way, like the role of the designer. One might imagine there are things that we will be doing now and in the future that are new, but the underpinning idea that the designer is someone who is flexible in order and responds to context and always has done is unchanged. That's a completely constant throughout history. So I'd say one of the funny things, and it sounds corny, we've been saying for decades how much smaller the world is getting, but it really has got very small in the last few months. And we're operating in different ways socially and professionally to one another. And I think, as Mette is saying, this notion of dialogue and interaction, social stimulation, stimulation from physical objects, access to machinery, noise, peripheral vision, accidental conversations. These things are changing. They're now happening in this environment in funny spaces like spare rooms in houses and basements and rooftops. I've had chats with people sitting on a rooftop with a post office tower in the background and so on. So I think all of that is a huge challenge, but I think the thing that makes us feel charged by addressing that challenge is our privilege. The privilege that we have to be in a very fortunate percentile of the world population, that we have access to intelligence, to networks, to the communities that this event has pulled together in a very short space of time in a very impressive way. And I think that is something which is really is a stimulation in itself. The notion that we've come together so quickly, so powerfully in this kind of small world way, and joined up conversations about things that matter to the substance of our work. I think academic conferences are often networking of what each person has done in parallel or in accumulation. But what's happening now is that we're talking about what we can all do together. I think that's a fantastic place to be. What's unchanged is the uncertainty of the future, I suppose. You know, I mean, it's very hard to tell right now where we will be in 3 months' time, 6 months' time. It used to be, we would say, in 10 years' time. So this notion of the future being uncertain is an unchanged condition that I think the designer and the researcher has been addressing throughout their entire lives. But the speed obviously has crept up upon us. So there's a lot of things in play that, and sometimes for me, I find the very same thing can be both a positive and a negative, or you know, it might have changed, it might have not changed. But I'd say one of the things that we might open up in this conversation is the way we're all finding common ground, the way we're all looking for ways to work together.
Maybe just to add up a little bit on this and sort of highlight one aspect that I find interesting is that in particular in this group, I think we have worked very hard on actually bringing the digital and the computational closer to the physical and even the corporate. And I think exactly that facet was now somehow challenged by this pandemic. So I think it's interesting that we made this over the last almost 2 decades by now. We made the journey from the paperless studio to actually the engagement with the very physicality of the research. And we have built up infrastructure to do so. We have built agendas to do so. And I think this is exactly the part that is now struggling, no? The kind of engagement with the very materiality of as an essential component of our research on digital technologies. So maybe it would be interesting to understand of how you see this having an impact. I think at the moment we all assume this is a temporary situation and we go back to the lab eventually. But maybe this going back to the lab will be also a changed condition given what we have experienced over the last few weeks. I mean, it's basically a question that relates to what is the role of technology in maintaining that bridge between the physical, the corporate, and the digital.
If I may, Achim, because I think that you are touching upon a very crucial, let's say, part of our work, no? This merge of digital and physical, the digital and the material. And to me, it kind of seems that this translation of digital or this combination of digital with material, it has different levels that we can approach it from. And of course, one is being in the laboratory and being able to use our machines and being able to be immersed in a parallel, let's say, digital design research and fabrication at the same time. But on the other hand, there is a material aspect that has to do with the society, that has to do with, let's say, the current challenges that people have gone through this crisis, during this crisis, but also during the climate change. I mean, there are a lot of places in the world that they are in similar conditions than the one we have experienced during the pandemics. And I think that this overlap of digital with what is happening in the society and trying to use digital technology, not necessarily to materialize new construction techniques, but to materialize solutions that would radically rethink the way that we inhabit, for example, public space, or the way that we interact socially. I think this also becomes very relevant. It was always very relevant, but now it becomes even more. And I just want to share an example, the fact that, like so many apps have been emerged through the government in order to surveil, quote to quote, the health of people for their benefit. And then, although we use so sophisticated technology to try to control this health crisis, we saw that when decisions were made on how we inhabit our built environment were as radical and as simple as please stay in your house, lock down, like don't use the public space, don't interact outside. And I think that there are alternatives to that. No, what if, for instance, we use this data in order to understand how we can inhabit public space during time, no, rather than saying public space is a no man's land for 3 months or for 2 months and a half in the case of Spain. So I think that there are a lot of opportunities opening up into how digital technologies can affect this other material aspect of society that goes beyond, let's say, a machine or goes beyond a specific materiality in our prototypes.
I really enjoyed that. I'd like to follow it up a bit about tacit knowledge as well. That I think you don't kind of lose knowledge this quickly. You know, it's embedded in you, and it, particularly knowledge around the physical. There's even muscle memory of how you lift objects and how you make things with your hands. I think the point that you're raising with your question, Achim, is a fascinating one, because I think one of the motivations for me, and I think it was common for a lot of us, in grabbing digital fabrication as a territory for the designer to occupy, almost goes back to a kind of medieval notion of an architect, someone who understands structure and physicality and design and space holistically, that they haven't separated the drawing from the thing, the object from the drawing. And I think that's been a wonderful um, a journey to be on for the last 25, 30 years or so, that we have now regained the knowledge of the tactile in the domain of the designer. And I think that gives us assets that can be used in different ways now going forward. Maybe proximity for everyone involved in that territory to materials is going to shift, but the expertise that's been re-injected into the profession or into the discipline over the last 25 years is an immense achievement. And there's an enormous amount that will still continue to spur on from that. So I actually think this community is extremely well equipped to deal with challenges that are ahead. But we will be maybe operating a bit like the surgeon using telerobotics and the notion of the memory of the physical and the remote accessibility to the site of fabrication might be a new experience for those of us just around the corner.
Yes, I want to follow up what Bob Shiel has mentioned about the robotic future. Actually, what is really happened. My role is not only educator, but also I'm a practitioner. So after the post-pandemic era, actually, we are doing some very experimental things. I think it's a collaborative platform because the designers could collaborate on the online platform, and at the same time, we can control like more than 20 robotics working together, and similarly working on the pavilion is actually only one or two people is on site with a robotic controller, but the other designer actually, which is spreading out all of China. So that is like the ways where testing is really changed the ways how we organize a design group and how we organize the design process and how we organize the fabrication and construction process. So that's something we didn't test before, but actually which really worked. If we can separate the visualization process with the materialization process, we can separate the data process to some material process. Actually, that can totally based on different kind of platform. So platform is, I think, is engaged into a new horizon under this certain situation, which can push us to some new big leap forward, which is something new revolution. Actually, the robotics is some kind of tools with extending a certain distance from the human body, but actually we can control them in a very efficient way. So that's something really changing the working flow and changing the discipline right now. What's happening? The secondly, I think to the education. I think this year, Newledge and me, and also a group of including Achim in Europe, and we organize Digital Future. We find that education is also changed, totally switched to digital because we cannot meet our professor and students face to face offline. As everything goes to online. And after we send invitation, we found a lot of professors, educators, practitioners. They're really interested in sharing their knowledge with different people. And actually, more than this time, we have 75 workshops, and we have more than 900 applicants. I think everyone is looking forward to learning a huge amount of new possibility in the knowledge system, which is not same to what it's teaching us in the university. So that's a challenge. I think something changed in education because in the past, we want to go to some very famous university to learning from certain professors. But right now, it's another opportunity. We can learning from a lot of professors. We can learning from a lot special expertise and just through the online platform. And the knowledge can, if we want to share with others, at the same time, you can learning from others as well. So that is the kind of new sharing culture in a certain kind of knowledge. Maybe that's not the most advanced knowledge from the different research group, but that's good for the cross-discipline. We can learning from different expertise, maybe from some AI technology and also from robotic technology. It's kind of a new possibility in a very very short time and very short, very efficient platform. And the knowledge becomes a new ways of reorganization because that is some totally different to the traditional institutions, the universities, organizations. It's just an online platform which can give us a new opportunity. I think it's a new kind of sharing culture, and it gave us a new organization of the knowledge system. So that's something I think is changing totally to the digital in education, which can help us to reorganize our teaching, our academics. Okay, that's something I want to mention.
Yeah, great, Philip. I think you're putting your finger on a very specific situation, which I think is that I think we have seen a lot of, I would say, traditional institutions struggling with the threat of the virus, while others have actually responded in a very agile manner. And I think what is interesting is that for me, the digital futures has become almost like a quasi-institutional setup, no? Where I think it is interesting to see how the I would say, this crisis has been turned into an opportunity. I mean, the direct question that follows from that, I think, is what kind of transformation will our sort of established institutions, research and education institutions, will they need to go through, no? And how this very crisis will actually challenge our very idea of what an institution is, probably especially those who operate in the field of digital technologies and architecture. So, I mean, we have, I would say, world leaders from some of the most advanced institutions that operate in exactly this field here. So I would be really interested in understanding how you see how your particular institution is actually also transforming, willingly or unwillingly, in this process.
Well, I think that there is a big opportunity there. And I don't know, Philip, if you know, but there is a student of mine that he's doing his thesis that he had to go back to China just before the lockdown. And he's now actually at Tongji printing a cellulose-based architectural structure. And I have a couple of others in India that they are doing that in Fab Lab in Mumbai and in Pune. And I think that what is also what has revealed, let's say, this hybrid model of being able to take classes online because physically we are not at the same space, but also the combination with the collaboration of different schools, different laboratories of making or of fabrication is opening up an amazing possibility of thinking new models of distributed education. And we think these new models of distributed learning and knowledge, then the idea of institution, as Achim, you were saying, is slightly changing, no? Because the institution is not anymore a specific building or a specific, let's say, set of facilities and faculty, but it is a kind of a wider, let's say, understanding of course, content and agenda and faculty, but at the same time, these collaborations with other institutions, private, public, schools, or even individuals that have certain facilities that could give access to people that they could be far away from where the institution physically is, but they can continue without losing this possibility of prototyping and making and research by making and learning by doing. And I think that this is opening up a new possibility. Maybe the next, let's say, version of Digital Futures should be a global collaboration where it's not just people following by screen, but also laboratories connected in the world that people could eventually prototype where they are, no? And that is opening up for me a great possibility to rethink education beyond physical proximities, but also beyond, let's say, closed boundaries of institutions that has a specific name and a specific address.
I would like to, I really also have very much enjoyed that part of the Digital Futures program. I think what is so wonderful about it is this sort of democratization of access. So you can imagine people sitting very, very far away from the ability to go to Tongji or ability to go to our institutions and now being able to join. I think that's really the great opportunity, not necessarily to break down, but somehow to transform the eliteness of our institutions, because no matter how many opinions you might have about fee paying and so on, then it of course is part of the ability to enter our schools, is the ability to travel, the ability to afford to live in our countries, the ability to pay tuition. And there's something really wonderful about Digital Futures being pro bono from everyone, ability that everyone has just wanted to take part in this, that I think is also about returning to an idea of egalitarian education, which I think is very much part of the humanist tradition. And then I really love what you're saying, Areti, about this idea of where is the tool? No, it's also what Achim was pointing at before. Maybe the tool doesn't need to be at college, or it doesn't need to be within the research lab. It can also be within the street. You know, it can also be in our part of the world. There simply are no industries that are not fully digitized. So the access to these tools is pretty easy, and there are lots and lots of fab labs all across the city. So I could also see this, that the ability to work with these tools and the sort of foreignness of them, high-endness of them, could also be democratized, which would be a wonderful effect of these changes. Yeah.
Maybe just to follow up on that, I think we're all sharing this sort of urge to keep our diverse and rich culture alive. But if we really look at it, then the pandemic has actually triggered also quite an impulse reaction of isolationism and protectionism by politics, not only in regards to necessary health issues, but also to larger political and societal concerns. So I think this is somewhat directly opposed to the open, international, and diverse research culture that I think we have all been engaged in building over the last few years. So I would be interested to understand a little bit more how we could actually really show that this very culture, no, sort of its diversity and its, let's say, also its internationality, and the talent and innovation that can only originate in such a context, how can we actually show that this is essential to harnessing the long-term effects of this very crisis? I mean, I think this is sort of the model that would be directly opposed to what we observe in a lot of political decisions that we see being made at the moment.
Well, I maybe would refer to the Interchain project, you know, that Mette set up, and some of us were very proud to be part of. That we need to challenge the construction industry from its absolute roots, and then we also need this conversation to reach out to citizens, you know, everywhere, you know, and say that one of the most fundamental human practices is to build your own space. I think this would be a huge outcome of this event if knowledge of how to make buildings was disseminated across the population of the world. That it is contained within a very conservative industry, which many of us have been frustrated with for a long time, for its lack of imagination, lack of innovation, and its focus on profit and cheap building. And we've been looking at much more engaged and enriched ways of designing better things, more beautiful things, more functional things, more long-lasting things, more resilient things. And this is what the citizens of the planet want. They don't want cheap, nasty buildings built by developers and construction companies just interested in making profits. So maybe one major step forward this community could take now is to reach out to more and more people outside the industry, outside universities, people who live in our communities, and talk about how buildings are made. It was something that was crossing my mind with earlier questions about tacit knowledge. That I think, you know, early 21st century, late 20th century architecture was quite hard to read in how it was made. It was almost a sort of an attempt to make it impossible to read how the building was made. Everything seemed so seamless and almost made out of magical materials. And I think one of the things that is coming out now is the knowledge of how things are put together, coming from, say, the Minecraft generation, and accessibility to fab labs will make our kids, you know, and makers of buildings, you know, and makers of things. So I'm quite optimistic and positive about that. And I think we have this capacity in our domain to work with the philosophical, the high level, but also the practical. I think that's one of the things I've enjoyed most about this whole space throughout my life, is that you can jump from a philosophical, theoretical position straight into a practical one about how things go together. And I'm seeing this come to the fore in our conversations with our colleagues across the university in this crisis. Is the architecture department is leading many of the ideas for how the university should transform. And we're only 2% of our university. We're tiny, you know, just a small little piece of the university jigsaw puzzle. But we are getting our voices heard because we have this capacity to move in this way.
Okay, I want to follow up what is Bob Shiel mentioned. I think really appreciate Mette last year invite me to Chain. I think it's a great opportunity to learn this kind of PhD program and sharing with each other in European. I think it's a great opportunity to reorganize the kind of infrastructure. I think that is crossing different university, different institutions. It's a great idea. I can really admire what you're doing in Europe. But actually, this time I want to give you some data in the Digital Future event. Actually, the instructors from 33 countries, from 91 different institutions, And the students actually from 1,057 institutions, and Tongji University sharing the same number with UCL students. That's very interesting. And more than around UCL and Tongji, more than 200 students engage into the events. And for example, IAAC sharing the same number with SciArc and Harvard GSE. I think it's why it's so welcome, including MIT have like 7% from MIT. That's also a big number. I think that's interesting. I think the option is to make decision by the students. The students actually, they're interested in a kind of a new common ground and a new platform on which they can learning some actually the new avant-garde or new leadership in the world that can give them different kind of direction, different kind of demos with how they can reshaping their future in the academic area. So that's really interesting because the university style actually is you have very big name, one or two professors in your school, but actually if we reorganize a platform, we can attract the best university, the best institutions from the world. Actually, that's the best learning platform. If the university is a kind of learning platform, the branding for it and the history for it gives us a certain kind of physical experience for your learning in under certain kind of culture, but under certain kind of digital platform, maybe the distance or the ways of I think the efficiency of the learning process will give us a totally new, more efficient ways to have a certain kind of reorganization of your learning direction. So, I mean, during this kind of post-pandemic era, the knowledge system we can rethinking on that is that a very flat of certain categories by different kind of universities, or the knowledge should be reorganized by some new leadership, which may be located in different kind of institutions and different kind of different famous professors. I think the reorganization of the teaching program will have an extremely attractive, will be extremely attractive to the new future learning platform. That is something we should engage ourselves in a digital future. So what is the digital future? Actually, the knowledge is alternative transform super fast. At the same time, it's not in the very tradition or very long history among very eldest people, maybe because this time we have a lot of young instructors, they're just PhD students. They can leading a certain team, and a lot of the students like this kind of AI research workshops, and some of them interested in some data science research workshops. I think that's something very interesting. The knowledge system should be very efficiently reorganized on one hand, but at the same time, someone critically talking about if this kind of learning process really can go very deep or really sophisticated in certain kind of very physical research in such a short time. But then that's maybe something we should be thinking on how to collaborate with different people and make certain kind of research plan on certain topic. That is maybe very challenging, how to make a deep connection or very deep collaboration based on different kind of learning process or research process. So I mean, the time for us to rethinking on the reorganization of the institution model is the time for us to make this discussion on this digital future platform. So that's something I want to mention.
Okay, I think it's interesting to note that you talked a lot about, let's say, the frameworks and let's say the institutions in which we operate and how they may transform as a response to this human health crisis. But I think what we probably also should talk about a little bit is on what we're actually working on. So I think, of course, there is this, what I just mentioned, this kind of current human health crisis, but one could also say that there is this permanent planet health crisis, where I think, especially in recent years, we have seen a growing awareness of this kind of ecological crisis that architecture and architecture production is facing. So I think it's interesting to understand how, let's say, this very ecological crisis of the built environment will remain long after the pandemic has vanished, of course, because there's no simple vaccination against global warming. So my question would be how we will keep up the momentum that I think we have slowly, but actually quite decisively built up over the last few years, to strive for a kind of long-term sustainable architecture production in the context of short-term collapsing economies. So I think it's really about how do we prove the relevance of our work, and also how do we adjust our agendas so that, as Bob mentioned before, we can really demonstrate that what we're doing is of real relevance for the future development of the built environment.
If I may, Achim, I think that what the pandemic crisis showed to us is that the crisis that we are going through beyond health crisis or climate crisis, they are more than anything design crisis, no? Because everything is related with the models of inhabitation, the models of construction, and the models of economy and production that we have been setting up the last 200 years. Overcrowded cities, systems of production that they depend on long distance transport of goods or of people. Also, the fact that 7 million people die annually because of indoor and outdoor contamination, or like such a huge number compared to the ones of COVID, for instance. And I think that these, let's say, models have been the main carriers of the virus. If we were living on different kind of models of the famous 15-minute city model, that people work and live very closely, if we were not traveling so much, if we were not transporting so much products in and out, then we would have been much more resilient facing this crisis. And I think that the fact that this is a design crisis also gives us educators, design educators, a bigger responsibility. And that responsibility, in my opinion, cannot be limited just to the experts, cannot be limited just to educational models towards architects, designers, engineers. We need to be able to speak to a wider audience, but also to integrate a wider audience. And that wider audience, it's not only industries, or it's not only real estate, let's say, enterprises, but it's also plain citizens, because we are forced to change, we are urged to change the models of how we inhabit. We need to be able to raise awareness of how we need to inhabit, not only produce sustainable architecture, but also contribute to produce or to contribute into models of inhabitation that they are much more sustainable, that they are much more, let's say, interactive or transparent in terms of what data we interact with, or how we can get some awareness of what our patterns of living is, how our patterns of living is affecting certain aspects of the environment. And to me, there is an interesting question on that, no? How to expand education, and how to expand our responsibility to be able to not only speak to more people, but also work together with different agents, including society itself.
I can add a few words to that, and I think it's a very, very good question, Achim, and I think all the answers I have in my mind right now come down to politics, actually. I think the architectural institutions, many of them have been kind of notoriously apolitical in a sense, where politics exists at the level of the individual, you know, the professor who takes a position and leads a certain discussion, or students who take a position and start a campaign. The institution itself is often being quite kind of reluctant, or even dare I say it, afraid to position itself somehow. But I think that without a doubt, with the issues of the pandemic, climate change, and racial inequality, we must address the politics of our world and challenge our governments. Yeah, there are huge problems with capitalism that need to be addressed, that this crisis is throwing wide open. And the construction industry is at the center of it, the way in which it's set up and operates, who it serves, problems with the shortage of housing, the cost of housing. All these things are right in front of us, and I think we as a community who are engaged in these issues, there is a very strong thread of inquiry in around low cost housing, low cost construction, high performance buildings. This is definitely the future, perhaps less so the flamboyance of maybe of some of the past, much more the attention to putting buildings together that are affordable for people who need homes, people who need places to live in, schools, and so forth. So I think the future is going to be inevitably much more upfront about its politics, and I think in the UK in particular, you know, the issue about diversity and accessibility to education is an enormous issue, and something we've been working on locally is to reinvent the accredited education program. Some of you will know the RIBA Part 1, 2, and 3 system. We are launching a new structure for that next year, which is just the beginning of some change. It won't be enough. We'll need to do much more. And I think this is where things need to shift. The student voice needs to be much louder. I think in the schools, and I'll admit I'm talking about our own school, its intensity and its emphasis on production and the wondrous things that come out of it. It's an incredible community, but at the same time, the student voice could be an awful lot louder, and we want to hear it, and we must listen to it. And I think the difference between our experience as students and our current students' experience is getting wider at an enormous speed, and we must address that. So that's where I feel, you know, I'm focused at the moment, is to try and address inequalities that were there before the pandemic arrived, but they've been completely exposed, and the inequalities that are there for us to see must be addressed, and we must try to balance them.
Okay, I think this is really, I think, an important question, because I think, again, you can see impulse reactions that would probably consider what we are doing to be not in the very center of what society at the very moment needs. But I think, as Bob nicely showed, we have to make sure that we can demonstrate that we're contributing a facet that is somehow, I think, of crucial relevance for the future. I would like to hear how maybe from a Central European perspective, Mette would respond to that, and also how Philip, where of course also these problems, just because of the sheer numbers that we see in China, are on a different scale, and of course it's a very different system which you operate, of course, also. But I think it would be interesting to know how, in these very different contexts, you aim to keep the work, let's say, relevant to the larger society in which you operate. I think I would think that that is really an important question, because there's always the tendency to, I think, marginalize the design crisis, as Areti says. And I do agree that possibly what we're facing on all kinds of levels is a design crisis, the way we design the processes in which we operate, the way we design that the institutions have been designed, and possibly even the way we interact also with the larger society.
I think a part of that is maybe also the sort of embedded sophistication and thereby also alienation to the tool sets that we're using. I think across the digital design field, technologies can seem elitist or somehow foreign to the sort of proper architectural practice or sort of existing practice. And I think those divides are really changing very, very rapidly. They were before this crisis, but they're certainly also now. We have a PhD who started during the pandemic, who was going to look at how to track behavior in buildings. It's an industrial PhD, so it's done directly with an industry partner. And this has immediately changed into trying to understand how people are placing themselves and moving through buildings in respect to all of these distancing demands that we have. So I think it also sort of refocuses the relevance of the tools that we are working with, and places them in new design contexts that allow a broader understanding of why these tools should be necessary, or what it is that these tools can contribute in sort of very direct ways. At the same time, I really like this duality that you are pointing at, Achim, with the short temporality of the human health crisis and the sort of very extended temporality of ecological crisis. I think at a much larger scale, I think what is important for us to be able to demonstrate is really how it is that we provide new models for industrial fabrication of in-building culture. And I think this is what we are doing as a whole. Now, this is really the crux of it for all of our research effort. But it's really about trying to communicate clearer what it is that what are the alternative models? How do they affect us in the everyday? In CITA, we've been working in the last year and a half to build up a sort of bio-based design paradigm where we're trying to translate many of the tool sets that we've been working with into ideas around a harvesting practice, cyclical practices in which we are engaging with sort of ecology as an open system. How do we then build with materials that will decay, that will reform, and that will become new buildings again? And I think this can be seen very, very speculative and far off. And the point is to connect it to other kinds of movements that are happening across society, which are about democratized fabrication, which are about maker movements, which are about trying to, as Bob was saying, trying to take into power again our own ability to construct the environment around us.
Yes, I think it's a really interesting question. Talk about the special era. It's a kind of yes, I agree. It's some kind of crisis, not only to the design discipline, but also the social process also like stop in a very short time. But at the same time, I think through certain kind of community like the digital future, right now we invited all your guys. I think we make a lot of promotions for you to the quite a different world to Eastern China, and to know what we are doing in the past. I think we make a lot of promotion for the avant-garde for the people of the institutes who play a leadership in the industry innovation or in the new knowledge development. I think it's a great demonstration to the whole discipline to have new direction and showing the high performance buildings or the more efficient, more environmental friendly architectures can give us a new opportunity to crowd this kind of crisis. So I think we need, so the topic this year is, we set up is like the Architects United. I think it's time for the people like you can show a special leadership to all the world, because we have some very interesting and high tech or some new technology development, which is the sharing on certain kind of platform, not only plugging in different kind of software, but also some hardware like some robotics. I think that is some really special platforms, special tools can make the innovation to what is design and what is the new industry can do in the future. So I think maybe at this certain kind of time, a certain post-pandemic era, it's not to make some new innovation in a very short, this kind of situation. Maybe it's opportunity to unite all the people together and can make some demonstration what we can do for the future. I think the education and I think the promotion for the new technology is very meaningful. And for example, actually, in the past 2 months, we have a lot of connection to the biggest development group, like China Construction Group, which is the largest one in China. They actually very interesting in what we're doing through the promotion of the very big event. They find a lot of very interesting topic through different kind of workshops, because that is special time they can stop and see what we have in the academic world. And that is actually a special opportunity to educate not only the students, but also to educate the whole social productive process, a productive infrastructure system, the framework of the industry. So I think that's a great thanks. I think to all the institution leaders like you, and you actually we united together to make some special event and actually not only educate our students right now, but also we make some demonstration to educate the whole social process. So that's maybe on the thanks to all.
Okay, I think we are slowly but surely coming to an end of our conversation. I think we already may have lost Philip, but I think I have to say it was an enormous pleasure actually to talk with you. I think it was also good to see that there's positive spirit and that there is a mutual agreement that education may play a decisive role in how we deal with this crisis long term. But I think we're also all left with a sense that there's a lot of things to do and a lot of, I would say, facets of our work that we'll need to transform. So again, thanks a lot to all of you. I hope you enjoyed as much as I did, and I hope we'll be able to meet again physically soon. Bye-bye.
Bye all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.